It's all yours, Nick.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our meeting of the Pasadena Civil War Roundtable, still virtually, but we're looking at the possibility of going back to in-person meetings as soon as January. That's not definite yet, but that is the target date at this point. We will know more next month because by then we should have a better idea of whether the facility is going to be open by our January meeting date, which is, of course, the tricky part. It would be awkward to have to stand outside and do a meeting outdoors, especially in January. But what we're finding is that a lot of the places are slowly going back to in-person meetings and gatherings. The West Coast Civil War Roundtable Conference is going to be in person. The downside is it's going to be in Fresno, so a lot of people won't get there anyway, but that will be the first weekend of November. And for those of you who are regular members of the group and get our mailed things, you should have the mailing information. Oh, Mike has said that it's been canceled. When was that? Because as of a few days ago, it was still going. Mike, you're muted.
I actually just muted everybody, and I have them all in there. Let me turn off the. Let me turn on the ability for them to be able to unmute themselves. Give me one moment here. All right. You can unmute yourself there, Mike.
Yes, our program director got a voicemail from Ron Vaughn, and then he texted me saying it was canceled. And I just now texted George Foxworth, and he confirmed that it has been canceled.
Okay. Well, that must have been a very recent decision then. I'm sorry to hear that because oddly enough, at least one of the speakers was one of our, in fact, our longest member of the group, Professor Stanbury. So I'm sorry to hear that they've had to cancel it this year. I'm hoping it wasn't for anything other than lack of people signing up to attend, which is what I was hearing, that people were concerned about trying to get to Fresno for a conference this year. Anyway, back to things for this meeting. As I said, we're going to try and go back to in-person meetings in January. One of our first few meetings in person will be partly an auction because for some funny reason, we've been accumulating stuff that we haven't been able to do in-person auctions with. And so we've got a lot of stuff built up. So in one of the first few meetings, we will have a short presentation of some kind along with a longer than usual auction. We'll let people know as far ahead of time as possible when this will be scheduled. We do know that all of the possible options for where we can meet, including our preferred one, will cost more money than we were having to pay using the Central Library's auditorium. There, for those of you who were not aware of how that worked, we were only having to pay for the audiovisual equipment and the setup for that. So we were basically having to pay for a little bit of somebody's time and energy and wear and tear on the equipment. Renting a facility is going to be more expensive, and we're looking at different options for what to do with that. We can manage it based on our current budgeting situation, but if costs of some other kind go up, it will be awkward. In fact, costs of other kinds have gone up. Cost of mailing you your issue of the call went up 3 cents just recently. We have enough stamps so that it won't affect us this calendar year. But the point is that copying costs or other things could go up. Replacement envelopes already went up. So one of the options the board is looking at is switching away from a mailed newsletter to something where we can send the same thing out electronically. But we'll need to talk to the membership first because it's not clear that everybody has email addresses that they want used for getting newsletters. So just bear in mind that it's possible that the delays in getting things done will make it a little easier for us to figure out the budgeting for next year. So on to this evening's program. As I was mentioning to him, I was actually familiar with one of the things that Dr. Jordan does because I read the Civil War Monitor and read its book review columns, which he is the person who coordinates. But he's also been writing a lot of other things, books, articles, essays, and one of his books, Marching Home, came this close to getting the Pulitzer Prize. And I'm sure he'll tell us a little bit about that, but he's here tonight to talk about his more recent work, which is about the common soldier in the Civil War and his studies from the viewpoint of examining the 107th Ohio Regiment and the soldiers in that unit. So ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome Dr. Brian Jordan.
Well, thank you so much, Nick, for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here this evening. Well, I certainly wish we could be in person tonight. I'm grateful that so many Civil War roundtables, such as your own, have leveraged these digital tools to ensure that our important work can continue throughout this pandemic. Tonight, I am indeed grateful to have the opportunity to share with you some findings from my most recent book, 1,000 May Fall: Life, Death, and Survival in the Union Army. At the heart of this book are the men of the 107th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, an ethnically German regiment mustered from a dozen northeastern Ohio counties during the dark days of the Civil War's second year. Very nearly 70% of the men on its muster rolls were ethnically German or foreign-born. While immigrant soldiers, of course, were hardly unknown in Lincoln's armies, more than 200,000 ethnic Germans, after all, and nearly as many Irish immigrants would fight in United States Blue between 1861 and 1865. Units in which foreign soldiers outnumbered native-born men were pretty rare. The 107th Ohio indeed was one of just 30 ethnic regiments among the more than 3,500 military outfits that fought for the Union. Yet the men of the 107th Ohio weathered the numbing human ordeal of the war in some ordinary ways, even as language and identity and popular perceptions of their fighting prowess would set them apart. They were men, I write in the book, betwixt and between, men who belonged but did not. They displayed courage and cowardice, their personnel earning both courts martial and, on one remarkable occasion, a Medal of Honor. They whipsawed between heroism and heartbreak, duty and dereliction, cynicism and conviction. They endured the war's extremes, shivering in squalls of snow at Brooks Station in Virginia and flagging under the fevers of Folly Island in South Carolina. They swatted at gluttonous mosquitoes in camp and navigated treacherous roads on the march. They battled treasonous rebels at the front and then exchanged taunts with contemptuous civilians back home, resisting with equal vigor both Republican radicalism and Democratic defeatism. They knew the taste of victory, participating alongside the fighting 54th Massachusetts Regiment in a rail-twisting raid into the heart of the Palmetto State in the war's final year. But more often than not, they felt the ache, the sting of defeat. Indeed, the 107th lost half its strength in two successive outings at Chancellorsville and Gettysburg. Miraculously, they managed to find the thick of the killing on the war's bloodiest battlefields. When they returned north in 1865, they tended to the onerous errands of memory and to the agonies of the many chronically sick and wounded, disabled men among them. They took pride in their pain, insisted that they had maintained a monopoly on misfortune, and claimed an authority over the war that derived directly from their suffering. Hard luck and treachery, real and imagined, sharpened the regiment's understanding of the war and the meaning of its service. Now, these are not the kinds of Civil War soldiers that most Americans know. Indeed, they're not the kinds of Civil War soldiers that most of my colleagues write about. According to scholars like James McPherson and Bill Wiley, Earl Hess, Billy Yank was steel-jawed, sure-footed, self-restrained, motivated by patriotism and a keen sense of what was at stake in the contest. The escalating demands of the war paid him remarkably little trouble, according to these accounts. If anything, experiences under fire or in proximity to chattel slavery only magnified his convictions. One scholar contends that the war served to abolitionize Lincoln's legions. Inured from most hardships, these reassuring histories have exaggerated, I think, Billy Yank's courage, pluck, and determination. But still another body of scholarship has worked to foreground the Union soldiers' anguish, misery, and woe. In these accounts from the likes of Michael C.C. Adams and Gerald F. Linderman, the natural, physical, and psychological deprivations of war exhaust the youthful idealism that first inspired the Yankee soldier to enlist. On blood-soaked killing fields, he confronted the stark divide between the glittering war he imagined and the gruesome war he fought. War's mounting demands sapped his strength, promoted disillusionment, and prompted Billy Yank to slip into a self-imposed hibernation after the war for at least 15 years, period during which he allegedly refused to think or to write or to even speak about the war. Well, both views have revealed some important truths about Civil War soldiers and their service. They have equally effaced, I think, the war's lived complexities, positing narratives of progress or declension that ultimately fail to capture the murk and muck of life in camp and on the march, the urgent human demands of carrying on, standing guard, putting one foot in front of the other, the satisfaction of having suffered, sacrificed, and somehow survived. The war did not unfold in a neat and tidy and predictable way. Men nursed doubts only to then gain hope and then misplace it again. The pall of grief, the pain of injuries, the effects of chronic disease, these things could reemerge at any time, unannounced and unwelcome. Empty sleeves were honorable scars in contemporary parlance, but so too were frostbitten toes and cooked fingers, raspy coughs, and labored breaths. By recovering how a community of men navigated the many mercurial demands of war, regimental histories are, I think, ideal vessels for rendering a more complete, capacious, and inclusive narrative of our nation's deadliest conflict, one that maps the liminal space between ennobling narratives and lived realities. Regimental histories can help us to reach beneath sweeping generalizations that go begging. They can retrieve something of how the war was actually lived, felt, intuited, and experienced. In this particular moment, when the never-ending battles over Civil War memory have been re-energized, when the blithe pundits wonder if our age of political brinksmanship will yield to a second Civil War, this is essential work. Modern readers will doubtless regard A Thousand May Fall as a contribution to the so-called new military history, because it moves beyond questions of tactics and strategy, who went where, when, and why, to probe the larger culture and society that shaped and informed the fighting in the first place. Perhaps more accurately, however, the book revives a very old type of military history, indeed, the very first genre of Civil War writing. As the historian David Blight and others have pointed out, regimental history was the first form of Civil War history. Hoping to preserve and contextualize something of their experiences, hundreds of veterans took up their pens and produced unit histories in the decades after the conflict. Among these veteran authors was Jacob Smith, an ambulance wagon driver from the 107th Ohio, who hoped as late as 1910 that something of the toils, danger, labor, and hardships of soldiers in the Civil War, as he put it, might finally make its way into print. As Smith's remark suggests, regimental histories were substantially more than gilt-edged reminiscences or empty exercises in self-promotion. They were carefully considered, amply documented, finely grained, very often painstakingly researched accounts of how the Civil War annexed ordinary lives, families, and communities. Especially as the decades wore on, these works stood in sharp contrast to the popular national accounts that looked nostalgically on the conflict and sterilized its violence. Evoking the spirit then of these early unit histories, 1,000 May Fall rummages around snowy winter camps, trundles along dusty roads, and prowls along distant picket lines to reveal how real people negotiated the war and its long aftermath. Its pages teem with soldiers who attempted to do their duty as they understood it. Volunteer citizen soldiers who, confronted with some impossible circumstances, sometimes faltered, often struggled to maintain hope, and not infrequently wondered whether the war was worth it at all. But for a few truly horrifying days in Virginia and Pennsylvania, concluded the great-great-grandson of one of the 107th Ohio's enlisted men, their duties required the solid virtues of middle America and not uncommon valor. By centering such men in our narrative frame, by amplifying their long marginalized voices, we can begin to map something of the Civil War's human topography. A retelling of the 107th Ohio's service in the Civil War develops at least three arguments. First, to a degree that scholars have not fully appreciated, the war's spaces, places, and environments shaped soldiers' attitudes toward the war and informed their emerging understanding of the conflict. Tramping across starkly militarized landscapes awakened men to the war's earnest realities, while zagging along miles of trenches and makeshift forts impressed upon them something of the war's enormous scale. As they swung picks and spades and muscled logs onto corduroy roads, the men acquired a new, more capacious understanding of the war's scope and complexity. Equipped then with this new understanding, they measured the physical and metaphorical distance between the home front and the battlefield. Second, and not unrelatedly, experiences between battles and behind the lines, I think, did as much, if not more, to inform regimental identity than combat itself. Though we often recount the war as an unbroken sequence of battles and military campaigns, the war from the soldier's perspective amounted to long stretches of strategic inactivity and numbing picket duties, punctuated by only the occasional rendezvous with the enemy, engagements that themselves often remained enveloped in the proverbial fog of war. Indeed, Civil War soldiers spent much more time in camp and on march than in battle. And so it should follow that these experiences proved crucial to their morale, to their motivation, and to their sense of unit pride and identity. And we've paid too little attention to them as a body of scholars. Finally, the war continued to annex the lives of its survivors and their families, who grappled to escape the conflict's shadow. Even those who returned to lead meaningful and civically engaged lives, and there were many, even those suffered quietly and painstakingly with the legacies of the conflict. Ugly wounds prevented Frank Rothermel from opening his mouth more than 1/3 of an inch, Theobald Hasman from raising his hands above his head, Peter Scheib from extending his arm. A shell wound not only deafened Lanson McKinney, a bricklayer from Stark County, but left his face badly disfigured. Together, these men bore witness to the war's violence. Their furrowed brows and unsteadied gaits supplied compelling testimony about all that they had seen and experienced. The war was something indelibly inscribed on their bodies, something they were never able again to escape. The loss of pre-war trades and independence and mobility afflicted still others in a society where one's capacity for manual labor proved a marker of manhood and martial masculinity. More than a few of the regiment's veterans ended their days in the wards of state insane asylums and county poorhouses. In short, as I've argued elsewhere, the war went on. For the men of the 107th Ohio, that war began at Camp Cleveland, a sprawling training complex sited on about 50 acres immediately south of that city on Lake Erie, September the 9th, 1862. The unit's enlistment motivations defy any neat categorization. Some saw in the Secession War a continuation of the failed democratic revolutions of 1848 that had romped across Europe. It was an opportunity to fight Smith-Siegel and strike at slavery. In defiance of their elders, a dozen young men stole away from Zor, a communitarian society on the Tuscarawas River, persuaded that pacifism was no longer practical with slavery on the line. For others, pecuniary inducements appealed more powerfully than patriotism. Whatever their motivation, some 994 men would answer the regiment's first roll call that September. With fewer than 3 weeks of training under their belt plates and shoddy Austrian muskets on their shoulders, the 107th Ohio set out on its first assignment. Earlier that summer, a Confederate raid had looped to within 60 miles of Cincinnati. And though the immediate threat had passed, Ohio's War Democrat Governor David Todd ordered his fresh recruits into the earthen works near Covington, Kentucky, in an effort to reassure the Queen City's yet uneasy denizens. If the care with which 21-year-old John Brunny, a musician in the 107th, described it is any indication, the regiment's first march in Kentucky proved a formative episode. At first, things moved forward, accompanied by song, Brunny explained. But then the temperatures rose, the haversacks grew heavy, and muscles became sore. Thirst set in and clouds of dust choked the air. These factors increased the weakness of our human powers to such an extent that after only 3 miles, dozens looked to desert. Cursing officers struggled to keep the men in the ranks as they lost courage and collapsed along the side of the road. This first march invited the 107th Ohio to reconsider its naive optimism, to distinguish between cowardice and straggling. Further, when it was revealed that the unit had spent the entire day marching in circles, that its destination could have been reached in but an hour, men openly questioned both the perspicacity of their leaders and the absurdities of war. Still more taxing marches awaited the men once they were transferred to the seat of the conflict in the Old Dominion. Roads caked in a thick porridge-like muck arrested the Army's progress in the winter of 1862-63, supplying an uncomfortably apt metaphor for the progress of Lincoln's arms. With all the marching we did, we've not done anything toward ending this war, a hungry, bleary-eyed, and footsore soldier rued. Aimless bustle only invited skepticism, or in the case of Burnside's mud march, in which artillery chests and limber wagons were literally swallowed up in thick mud, humiliation. The Buckeyes settled in for a long winter north of the Rappahannock River, shivering in squalls of snow and ice as waves of dysentery, chronic diarrhea, typhoid made their deadly romps through the ranks. The winter encampment of 1862-63, it proved a most illuminating experience for the regiment. Operational historians have long recognized that the months the Army of the Potomac spent moored on the north bank of the Rappahannock amounted to a strategic pause, a prized period for the troops to rest and restore, resupply, regroup forces. But less fully appreciated is the extent to which that encampment invited sustained reflection among enlisted men, both about their participation in the war and about the peace movement then rapidly gaining adherents on the northern home front. Indeed, this winter encampment, the Army of the Potomac's Valley Forge, if you will, coincided with the ascendancy of the anti-war Copperhead Democrats, whose leading exponent, the Ohio Congressman Clement Laird Vallandigham, had delivered an anti-war, anti-Lincoln, anti-abolition tirade on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, the very day the 107th Ohio trudged toward its campsite at snowbound Brook Station. Throughout the North, many Republicans decried Democratic defeatism, but nowhere did the opposition to that Copperheadism blaze with more righteous indignation or fury than in the camps of the 107th Ohio. From their makeshift winter huts, the men penned letters and ratified resolutions expressing their fervent desire to see the war prosecuted through to a vigorous conclusion. If they don't want us to come down here and fight, one of the unit's enlisted men recommended, why, let them keep their mouths shut and not disturb us. I will leave my bones to bleach on the battlefields of the sunny South, this soldier retorted, before I will say compromise or enough. All I ask, another of the Buckeyes insisted, is for those who know nothing of war and its ravages to hold their mouths and not discourage those who are risking their lives in an effort to restore a tottering government to its former position. Idealizing their suffering, shivering, and sacrifices, the men of the regiment invited a contrast between their own masculinity and the unmanly agitation of the stay-at-homes. Some of the men even expressed their desire to engage the Copperheads in open warfare. In an intrepid editorial, one private proposed to send some of our weather-beaten soldiers home, armed with a gun and a bayonet and 60 rounds of cartridges. Christian von Gunden, who shouldered a rifle in Company I of the 107th, agreed to even forego a much-anticipated furlough if and when he would be issued orders to confront the Copperheads. Halfway business is about played out, Christian Schreiner explained. It would indeed be a deplorable thing if civil war should break out in the North, but if it cannot be avoided in any other way than by yielding to the Copperheads and the Mudsill rebels, I say, let it come. Now, scholars, of course, have rightfully lauded the administrative, dietary, and hygienic reforms championed by Major General Joseph Hooker for their role in reviving the morale of Union regiments on the eve of the Chancellorsville campaign. But no less significant, I think, were these months of restless immobility spent in windswept camps. Clarifying what was at stake in the war, anti-war opposition on the northern home front promoted an ironic sort of unity among the rank and file. These Democratic traitors cannot humbug me, von Gunden attested. The more the Copperheads rave, Schreiner echoed, the more determined the men in the army get. Our cause is just and must prevail, another enlisted man declared. And if slavery should thereby be sacrificed, all the better. Have the cause of all this bloodshed removed. And then when we get peace, we'll have a permanent peace. There is an army pride growing up, even now in full existence, that will make it irresistible, explained one enlisted man brigaded with the 107th. What is very important, that pride will place this army entirely beyond the influence of Copperheadism at home. That renewed strength and unity would be sharply tested, however, when the Army of the Potomac engaged these men at Chancellorsville the first 3 days of May 1863. For its part, the 107th Ohio shook out into a line of battle at the Tally Farm along the Orange Plank Road, holding the extreme right of the Union Army and the 11th Corps. Throughout the morning of May the 2nd, 1863, reports about an ominous buildup of enemy troops on that right flank proliferated at Army headquarters. But even so, nothing could have prepared the men for the staggering force of the crippling blow delivered just after 5 o'clock by Stonewall Jackson's 26,000 whiskey-baited rebels. Jackson's men had stolen through the tangled scrub of a second-growth Virginia forest on a dozen-mile flank march that delivered them to the exposed Union line. It was sheer pandemonium. The bullets, Christian Riker marveled, just whistled by my head like a real hailstorm. The men squeezed their triggers earnestly and stood as long as a stand could be made before falling back in a full chaotic retreat. If we'd remained but 5 minutes longer, the Ohioans' lieutenant colonel insisted, we all should have been killed and taken prisoner. As it was, the regiment's losses and its baptism of fire had inflicted staggering losses. The rebels had killed, wounded, or bagged as Richmond-bound prisoners some 220 men. Losses were especially great among commissioned and non-commissioned officers. Even the regimental surgeon, the old 48er Charles Hartman, was killed, a fate that would have deleterious consequences decades later for ailing veterans pursuing pension claims after the war. Though the collapse of the 11th Corps line in no way preordained the Federal Army's crushing defeat at Chancellorsville, Northern newspapers would predictably, effortlessly seize upon the so-called stampede of its ethnically German outfits as the devastating battle's decisive moment, cleverly effacing the failure of native-born leadership that provoked the crisis at Chancellorsville in the first place. Threats, entreaties, and orders of commanders were of no avail, the Daily National Intelligencer seethed. Thousands of these cowards threw down their guns and soon streamed down the road toward Hooker's headquarters. The New Hampshire Sentinel echoed that the Germans fled past General Hooker's headquarters in a panic. Many of the members of Hooker's staff with pistols and sabers, vainly endeavoring to stay their flight. For weeks, these false-hearted allegations, embroidered with an ugly nativism, annexed Northern newspaper columns. The press, one especially perceptive observer commented, was just anxious to lay the blame for the defeat at Chancellorsville on the door of some despised foreigners. Only months after indicting the Copperheads for their misdeeds then, the 107th Ohio found itself in the surreal position of responding to allegations of cowardly conduct of their own. In answering these charges, they further organized their ideas about courage and duty, clarifying the nature of their commitment to the war. I saw a letter yesterday from home, Lieutenant John Winkler reported, stating a report that our company left the battlefield and had run at the appearance of the rebels without firing a shot. In a tart epistle addressed to the Worcester Republican, the Wayne County soldier explained that it was his duty to inform our friends at home of the facts. We went forth to do battle for the Union and the Constitution, Winkler wrote, and we want to be used decently and not abused. In sharply worded missives, the men cataloged the battle's human destruction, wielding their lengthy casualty registers with pride as evidence of a brief yet hopeless stand. The memory of noble men gone to their graves, now languishing in hospitals, another correspondent from the 107th Ohio added, is entitled to this plain, unvarnished statement of facts. For the ethnic soldiers of the 11th Corps, the struggle to establish what happened along the Orange Turnpike would be nearly as trying as the battle itself. In this fight, however, they would enlist the support of the larger German-American community. From Manhattan to Cleveland, Ohio, mass meetings assembled to rebuke the calumniators and to hurl their slanders back into the teeth of their fabricators. At the Cooper Institute in New York, Friedrich Kopp, an ethnically German refugee who had penned several stirring histories of Hessian contributions during the American Revolution, leveraged his authority as a historian to denounce the defamation of the 11th Corps as dangerous, altogether dangerous to the Union cause. I never knew a soldier, he explained, who was willing to fight for the enemy in the front when his comrades or the people for whom he fights are standing ready to stab him from the back. Almost exactly 2 months after Chancellorsville, the 107th Ohio fell well short of the redemption that they would seek at Gettysburg, where another poor deployment on the extreme right flank of the Union line would deliver, well, similar results. On the afternoon of July the 1st, 1863, after a truly daring stand at the apex of a sharp salient that reached into the enemy position, the men scrambled frenziedly from Blocker's Knoll, a deadly perch to which they arguably should have never been assigned, leaving behind some 211 men killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Even then, the unit's adjutant, Peter F. Young from Cleveland, attempted to rally the regiment's broken remnants by defiantly waving the regimental standard at the old Adams County almshouse on the northern fringes of the borough. Just 171 men limped to the regiment's new position behind a low stone fence at the base of East Cemetery Hill, a position from which the survivors would turn back the next night, the Louisiana Tigers, and capture the colors of the 8th Louisiana. The orchestra of human misery occasioned by the Battle of Gettysburg would continue for days. The shrill cries and heartrending groans of dying soldiers to be the only serenade for the men on this 87th birthday of the once United States. Regimental Postmaster Alfred Ryder, detailed to the 11th Corps Hospital at the George and Elizabeth Spangler Farm, actually wore through the soles of his brogans, tracking back and forth between the haymows and the regiment, supplying urgent updates about grievously wounded men. After Gettysburg, in a move that seemingly confirmed the pejorative assessments of its ethnic soldiers, Army headquarters yielded to popular demand and abolished the ill-fated 11th Corps. In August of 1863, still dealing with the fallout of Gettysburg, the 107th Ohio was whisked to the war's margins. It would pass its last 21 months, marking time, conducting garrison duties in the Department of the South, in swampy South Carolina and Florida. Moored in exotic camps far from home, subjected to mindless drill and monotonous fatigue duties, the men could only betray their dejection and gloom in letters and diaries. We looked every hour upon the same naked beaches of sand, one enlisted man explained, the same old drooping palmettos. Unable to escape the thought that they had been consigned deliberately to irrelevance, the men no longer shined their shoes, folded their gum blankets, or polished their muskets. They snubbed military conventions that now seemed, well, but empty ceremony. Deprived of the opportunity to battle the rebels, they instead chronicled their campaigns against sand fleas and scorpions, wood ticks and mosquitoes. In this way, they could continue to suffer and indeed even bleed on behalf of the cause. Yet most just wanted the war to be over. Though several companies dutifully marked their ballots for President Lincoln in November of 1864, a plurality of the regiment's soldiers actually cast their votes for his opponent, George McClellan, believing that he was likelier than Old Abe to end the war. They were the only Ohio unit to deliver a victory to Lincoln's opponent. It is strange, remarked one Connecticut soldier who had fought alongside the 107th at Chancellorsville and Gettysburg, that men who have endured so many hardships and who have periled so much for their country should be so blind and ignorant as to support that which is working to destroy all the good they've ever accomplished. On the mossy islands of South Carolina, as for the rest of their lives, the men shouldered the burden of Chancellorsville. Bad conduct on the part of the Dutch had been so strongly impressed upon the native soldiers and upon the public, one veteran conjectured, that I doubt it will ever be eradicated and their character ever restored. Another veteran agreed with this rather austere assessment. Although numerous essays have since been written about that terrible conflict and disaster, exonerating the 11th Corps, he wrote some 3 decades after the battle, yet the stigma remains. And very frequently is the phrase heard, I fights mit Siegel and I runs mit Howard. Nor did it help matters that the regiment's finest hour of combat, a sprite skirmish with the rebels along Turkey Creek near Sumter, South Carolina, came on Sunday, April the 9th, 1865, at the very hour that Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. It was just their luck. Private Henry Finkenbender's daring dash across a burning bridge to develop the enemy position, his rescue of a wounded comrade, for which he earned the Medal of Honor, the heroic legacy of liberating dozens of enslaved persons, all of these things were to be eclipsed in memory. After the war, the regiment survivors lamented nothing more than having to frequently hear slurs thrown by even men who called themselves comrades, they protested, comrades too of the GAR. Segregation from the larger community of Union veterans reinforced the regiment's conviction that it was somehow uniquely unfortunate. So too did the cynicism of prying pension examiners, who looked skeptically upon pension claims for exposure to the elements and the effects of tropical climes. Not unlike Jacob Smith and their pension applications, made all the more difficult by the nature of their service. The veterans of the 107th Ohio rehearsed the story of their service as a pageant of woe. Neither convinced that they had climbed to the snowy heights of honor once described in elegy by Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., nor entirely ready to concede that the war had been some irredeemable folly. The men of the regiment instead fused pain and pride into a single interpretation of the war. Loss and anguish were, for even the most sentimental among the veterans, fundamental to the conflict's meaning. Celebrations of the war's results always implied a reckoning with its costs. For the men of the 107th Ohio, pain ennobled. Indeed, throughout the war, suffering and misfortune sharpened the unit's understanding of service and loyalty. Tainted with the stigma of cowardice, the 107th Ohio drew attention to its terrible record of slaughter, eager to attest that it had battled no less manfully than native-born soldiers. Because 20th century narratives of the Civil War had such little patience for agony and misgiving, they had no room for these, or indeed most other ethnic soldiers. Narratives of loyalty and suffering proved no match for tales stained by nativism and sentimentality. The Civil War instead became urgently our war, an epic brothers' quarrel and backyard scrimmage, not a remorseless revolutionary struggle waged by a significant number of immigrant soldiers. Today, the men of the 107th Ohio are hardly known, even in the counties and communities that sent them off to war. Their tales are today almost the exclusive province of descendants who remarkably maintain the bonds of regimental community. The bonds of comradeship would not just survive the war, but indeed survive the decades. Copies of the original regimental history produced by ambulance wagon driver Jacob Smith remain scarce, tattered heirlooms long forgotten. I've never in thought or word regretted what little I'd done for my country in the way of duty, Smith self-effacingly wrote in the conclusion to that tome, published in 1910. But I've always been proud that I'd taken some humble part in the great strife. Confident yet self-conscious, acknowledging the yawning void between the war he waged and the war his adopted nation preferred to imagine. The old soldier had penned, I think, a most fitting epitaph for his regiment. I want to thank you so much for your kind attention this evening, and I hope we have just a few moments to engage in discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Jordan. I am going to go ahead and let people unmute themselves. If you do have a question, You can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask it. If you'd like to be able to post it in the chat, you're welcome to do that there as well. We already actually have one comment already from Brian, thanking you for an interesting presentation, and I thank you as well for that. I do have a question myself for this. Actually, I have two questions. One is, what drew you to the 107th Ohio? What made you choose them as your focal point for this?
So I am a native of Northeast Ohio, and many of the communities that shouldered men into the regiment are communities that I know well. I did not begin, the project actually began 10 years ago when I was asked to prepare an essay for an anthology on cowardice in the Civil War. And my assignment for that project was to write about the only federal colonel who was court-martialed for cowardice at the Battle of Gettysburg, who was the colonel of the 107th Ohio, Seraphim Meyer. And so I dutifully went through the pension files and the court-martial records of Colonel Meyer, became absolutely enamored by his story and wrote up the essay, and then kept bumping into these guys in other projects. And really I became taken by kind of the idea of regimental history. And this is at a moment when a lot of other scholars, I'm thinking here of Leslie Gordon and Susanna Url, many others, Doug Edgerton, about the same time had been experimenting with unit histories. Leslie's written a very good book on the 16th Connecticut, Susanna Url on Hood's Texas Brigade, Doug Edgerton on the Black Regiments from Massachusetts. And at this moment, we were interested as scholars in thinking about how unit histories could become vessels to tell a more complete story of the war. Rather than reaching for those sweeping generalizations, what would the war look like from the rather oblique angle of 1,000 men? And I was kind of taken by that, and I had written so much about the 107th through the story of their colonel that I decided that really I had the raw material for a book that would also assuage something of my homesickness down here in deep East Texas for Northeast Ohio. So there you have it.
Okay, and I did say I had two questions, and the second question is related to that, in that this was essentially a foreign unit, being a German regiment there. And I've always been curious about that for the regiments that were made up principally of foreign born in there for that. What did you feel any way, what drew them to be U.S. soldiers and to fight on behalf of a country that that they were not native of? Is there anything that you saw that was different, perhaps, than a soldier that was native to the U.S. versus these that were immigrants in there?
It's a great question. The 107th was the fifth of six ethnically German regiments mustered from the state of Ohio. This was in the summer and fall of 1862, the brainchild of Governor David Todd. He thought, if we raise ethnic regiments, we'll be able to meet our quotas, and that men would be encouraged to go off and fight in units where they could speak their own language, where they could practice their own cultural traditions and celebrate their own heritage. And of course, he realized that Northeast Ohio was a place that, over the course of the 1850s, in the wake of the democratic revolutions, the failed democratic revolutions, there was a ton of German immigration, ethnically German immigration to Northeast Ohio. So this was kind of an ingenious strategy on his part. What encourages them to go off and enlist? I mean, part of it is the peerless reputation and effect of Franz Sigel, who just really, truly, I mean, this unit was advertised in the local papers. It was advertised that this unit was going to go off and fight with Sigel, and that worked like a charm. For some men, right, it is anti-slavery conviction. They see this as an extension of those failed democratic revolutions. They see the Confederacy as oligarchic and as an aristocracy, a slaveholding aristocracy, and to fight against slavery is an opportunity to continue this crusade that they'd begun on the other side of the ocean. For others, right, there are quite a number of men who come into the unit from the Turner clubs. these kind of gymnasiums and German cultural organizations that were, that worked to, that prided themselves in physical programs of physical training and strength, and a lot of those Turner clubs were also kind of intimately embedded in Republican politics. But there is also a number of Democrats in this unit. We often forget. I mean, I think because of Carl Schurz and others, tend to think about the German Americans as affiliated with the Republican Party, but there are quite a few who, owing to the Republican Party's dalliance with know-nothingism, remain deeply skeptical of the Republican Party and kind of fix themselves to, kind of the Democratic Party. So enlistment motivations, I write in the book, defy any neat categorization. I think that's really, really important, because even in this sample size of 994 men, you can find 994 different reasons that they went off to war. Individual motivations are a dime a dozen. But of course, there was one national cause. After January the 1st, 1863, they're fighting in a war to end slavery. Their personal convictions, whether they're for that or not, that's the cause of the Union. And I think too often in our discourse today, we conflate national causes and personal motivations. We do that on both sides, right? That's how we can explain that a Union soldier can be deeply racist, but still in a liberating army, and how we can explain a non-slaveholding white Southerner fighting in an army that was about preserving and extending slavery and white supremacy.
Thank you. There's a comment from George as well, thanking you for your presentation. Dear Dr. Jordan, excellent content and presentation. Thank you. I do have the audio opened. If you do have other questions, feel free to be able to go ahead and just unmute yourself to be able to ask a question directly. And again, if you want to be able to post something into the chat, I'll be happy to be able to read that for you as well. So I'm going to give people an opportunity to ask their questions as well.
Dr. Jordan, what was the overall impression of the higher ups in the Department of the South of the 107th Ohio?
Not very good. Indeed, things only get worse for them in the Department of the South in February of 1864. So Seraphim Meyer, I mentioned, was the only federal colonel court-martialed for cowardice at Gettysburg. He's spared being cashiered on a technicality. They did not swear during the court-martial proceeding. They hadn't sworn some of the witnesses in the presence of Meyer, and so they threw out the entire proceeding, which was good for Meyer on one level because he wasn't cashiered, but bad for him in the sense that he really wasn't exonerated, right? And the Judge Advocate General, in summarizing the case, noted that he believed that he was indeed guilty of abandoning his unit in the face of the enemy, and that's a conclusion that I concur with as well. So they get down to the Department of the South, and they started rotating officers in a lot of these regiments that the Army looked on skeptically. They started rotating officers before offering exams, right, of the officers, asking them to drill regiments and offer orders and commands. It was basically a test to determine if they had their chops as a military commander. And Meyer failed that test, and rather than face what was certain to be immediate dismissal, he tendered his resignation. So there was more humiliation to come. The one exception to that is this final week of the war, in this unjustly overlooked operation called Potter's Raid, which is one of the least chronicled campaigns of the Civil War, even to this day. Not very well chronicled because, of course, it overlaps chronologically with what's happening in Southside Virginia as Lee is making his way out to Appomattox. But they perform very, very well there, and that's the one exception to their time in the Department of the South. But they're constantly written up. If you go through the regimental order books, you'll see just the carping about everything from the cleanliness of the camps to the competence of the officers. It's not a good experience for them at all. And certainly there was even an attempt, and my friend Jonathan White has written a very, very powerful book on the election of 1864 and on intimidation by Republican officers of Democrats in the Army. And he actually suggests that there was a lot of voter suppression, a lot of intimidation, and frankly, a lot of soldiers who just didn't vote because they may have been Democrats and they didn't want to out themselves as Democrats in the Army. And you'll see the 107th Ohio Treaty that way as well. They anticipated that a lot of the Democrats in this unit were going to vote for McClellan. And so they did everything they could to try to prevent them from casting ballots, even though Ohio had just passed a soldier absentee voting law for the first time. So it's humiliation after humiliation.
Mike Hoover gave a quick plug to the Inland Empire Civil Roundtable meeting for the 12th. Mike Schaefer is the speaker with the Atlanta campaign. If you'd like an invitation, just to send an email to iecwrt@gmail.com. Another question in here from Stephanie. Was there any truth to the cowardice claim?
Truth to the cowardice claim for Seraphim Meyer, there certainly was, although in the book, I make the case that, that word kind of gets in the way of our understanding a little bit. What happened with Meyer, his son was the captain of Company C. And at Chancellorsville, when the unit is overrun by Stonewall Jackson, he is bagged, as so many of them were, as a Richmond-bound prisoner. Seraphim Meyer, the colonel, is bagged as a Richmond-bound prisoner, sent off to 6 weeks in Libby prison. And he's hauled to the rear, which is humiliation enough, but as he is hauled to the rear, he watches what he believes are his son's final moments. He watches as his son is wounded, crumples to the ground, and he's helpless, right? He's not only humiliated as an officer being captured, but he is in this surreal position of being a father who has seemingly watched his son die, and there's nothing he can do about it. Happily, it's not the case. The son was wounded, but not so seriously that it was fatal. He'll recover from the injury. Meyer will be exchanged after 6 weeks. They reunite in Ohio and then rejoin the unit in time for Gettysburg. But he goes out and when he deploys onto Blockers Knoll, right there north of the town, he finds himself in the exact same position that he was in 2 months before at Chancellorsville. He's on the extreme right of an overextended flank in a very exposed position, about to be enveloped by rebels. He is, all of his mind, his thoughts are flooding back to Chancellorsville. I believe that he has a sort of flashback episode to Chancellorsville, and certainly there's contemporaneous testimony I found from neighboring regiments that identify him. Oliver Otis Howard's brother, Major Charles Howard, identifies Meyer at a different point. I mean, there's enough evidence that you can triangulate to establish that Meyer did abandon the regiment in the face of the enemy, that he was unable to deliver orders in the appropriate manner, that he had this emotional episode. Some people described him as drunk. I don't believe that he was drunk. I believe that he was having what we today might call a post-traumatic stress episode. And part of the reason I'm able to make that argument beyond the contemporary evidence is I think after the war, right, the men maintain a cloak of silence about it. I mean, some of them offer some testimony during the court-martial trial, but after the war, he's not shunned, he's not drubbed out of the regiment. He writes one of the first thumbnail histories of the unit. He goes back to a position of prominence in Canton. He's elected to the Common Pleas Court. And I think that's because they didn't associate this as cowardice, even though by definition it was. They understood this as of what he made evident on that battlefield was the urgent human realities of war. And they were able to forgive him for that. And there was a cloak of silence about it. And I think, a lot of other histories of the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, David Martin's book and others, they kind of try to dismiss this as, oh, well, he was just, kind of swept up in the nativism. The nativism, of course, is real, as I've just argued. but we miss something if we look just to and we say, well, he was, this didn't happen. I think it did happen, and it tells us something pretty profound about how these men experienced war. When we think about them, Civil War soldiers, as custodians of historical memory, we often think about them as custodians of memory after the war. What we don't pay enough attention to is the fact that during the war itself, they're carrying experiences. They lug their former experiences in their knapsacks to specific battles. I mean, everybody who deploys onto Gettysburg, that was at Chancellorsville, they bring Chancellorsville to southern Pennsylvania, right? And they'll do that throughout the war, right? The previous experience, who they were, the communities from which they came before the war, shapes the kinds of soldiers that they'll become. Those are the kinds of connections that I find really interesting, and that I think we still have yet to explore.
Next comment in here is from Mike. Thank you again from a fellow Buckeye. My relative served with the 127th out of Chillicothe. I hope that we can continue to support the U.S. Postal Service and the employees, even if we have to increase our dues by postage, copying, and envelope cost. There's a question also from Elizabeth. To keep the soldiers' memories alive, are there any daughters of Union veteran tent groups celebrating the 107th Ohio?
Not to my knowledge. There was for a while a 107th Ohio reenacting outfit that was actually based out of Florida, which is in some ways appropriate because of their station for quite a while at Camp Milton and other places around Jacksonville. There's not a specific descendants group, although I'll tell you, in the course of researching this book, I encountered quite a number of descendants. And the amazing thing to me is that the descendants know one another still, the families of messmates and tent mates, and company comrades. They still know one another intimately. Major Augustus Vignos's folks still know Captain Billow's folks, and there are still those connections that are still very much visible. And I've and those descendants, they track with great fidelity the history of the unit. I've heard from a number of them since the book has come out. It's really kind of the unique province of the descendants right now. Hopefully will change.
We have no other comments in the chat area. If you have another comment, please post it in the chat. Or as I mentioned, if you want to unmute yourself and to be able to ask comment directly, you can. While we're waiting for people to be able to do that, I would ask you, do you have a follow-up in mind, another book? Maybe move on to the 108th, or, or you're just going to start down chronologically? So
I have been contracted to write a major synthetic history of the Civil War in about 250,000 words. So I am deep into work on that at the moment, and hope to have that out in 2024. I have no delusion that I'm going to displace some of the fine one-volume histories that are out there, but I'm the field has changed so much in the last 10 years. We have just such an incredibly rich scholarship that has taken us into everything from the environment to material culture to gender to really excavating the war as a lived human experience. So I'm going to try to pull all of that together into a big new interpretive synthesis of the Civil War, tentatively titled right now Crucible of the Republic, the trial and triumph of the Civil War. So we can expect you back in a couple of years to talk about that book? I'd love to, and hopefully by that time we'll be in person. I'd love to spend time at the Huntington Library, which incidentally has 3 107th Ohio letters. Oh, wow, fantastic. Huntington's one of my favorite places, so next time I'm there, we'll meet up. Jim also is thanking you for your presentation in there. Other folks that would like to be able to comment or ask a question, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Okay, if we don't have any other comments, Dr. Jordan, I do want to thank you for spending some time with us this evening. It's actually really fascinating to hear this, particularly as you had mentioned, most of what you hear is actually just focused on the leadership or focused on a particular battle or events, and to be able to hear it from a personal perspective. Personally, I have 3 ancestors that fought in the Civil War. All of them never rose above the rank of private. But I feel that personally that their experience was just as important because they were a contributing factor for whatever that they did. Some of them participated in some of the battles you mentioned. Some of them were just acting in the picket guard duty areas, as you had mentioned as well. And it seems that the 107th actually experienced a bit of both, certainly from the heights and glories of Chancellorsville and Gettysburg to the lows and depressions of what they saw in Florida and some of the sentry duties that they had. It's interesting to be able to see that in just some of that context in there for that. I have one final question for you here. You had mentioned that they actually had voted in support of McClellan rather than in support of Lincoln. Do you think if they had not ended up in the picket duty area, if they had remained in the battlefield area, that would have changed, that they would have seen a difference? Is there any deciding factor that caused them to be supportive more of McClellan in that regards, unlike most of the rest of their contemporaries?
Yeah, I think if they're not reassigned to the Department of the South, it's likelier than not that result is very different. I mean, I think that's a very real index of where they are at that particular moment. And again, it goes back to the argument about the importance of space and place and environments that shapes the way that people understand the war. And it's also important for us to, I mean, historians are when we deal with elections, there's snapshots of particular moments. And so often in our work, we quote a Civil War soldier and we use that to represent the entirety of their experience. When in fact, again, there are these crests and valleys, as you were just suggesting. There are highs and lows, and their morale and even their politics will ebb and flow with the circumstances, with the logic of events. And when they had become so disheartened by the way that they've been treated back home, right? They felt betrayed by folks back home. They feel as though they're betrayed by their compatriots in the army. And so I think they had little choice but to cast their ballots that way, feeling that this would bring an end to the war. But I think it's so important for us to resist those generalizations. That's what a unit history helps us to do, right? It helps us to reach beneath some of those things and to understand the war, keeping in mind that they didn't know how it was going to turn out, right? That they often could not assimilate their own role. They couldn't understand how their participation in these events, how they're holding that ridge line or this ripple of ground, how that was even important within the larger context of a battle, let alone a campaign or the war itself. And I think it's a remarkable thing, an absolutely remarkable thing that these men press on, they continue, they fight, they put one foot in front of another, acting on great faith, right? That what they're doing, that the orders that they receive are doing something toward ending that war, that they are doing something productive toward that cause. Unfortunately for the 107th Ohio, that was a faith they lost in 1864. But thank God for our United States today, it wasn't a faith that was lost by the vast majority of Union soldiers.
One last comment from Shannon. Thank you, Dr. Jordan. Very interesting to me, as I too am a Buckeye by birth. And I want to thank you for spending some time with us here. I know that it's late for you. I appreciate you staying up to be able to help us with this. And again, I really appreciate everybody that has attended here this evening and to be able to listen to the presentation. And we look forward to having you back again next month, and have a good evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.